Thank you so very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. And what we thought it would be important, since you are the key stakeholders in the agricultural sector, is perhaps to take a step back and look at some of the themes that are important for the agricultural sector. Because one way or another, the work that you do does influence the sector that we are in the agricultural sector. And in preparation for this conference with the leadership of the society, what we thought we should do is perhaps look at some of the realities, risks, and some of the reforms that are in the South African agricultural sector to set up a context of many of the conversations that you will be having in the next couple of days during this symposium. And the agricultural sector in South Africa today is even more important than perhaps in the early 2000s in thinking about where we're going as a country. Because we are in a space where the South African economy has not been growing. One can argue that over the past 15 years or so, this economy has not grown over 2%. And the key conversation then that is taking place now is what sectors of our economy we can pretty much try to revive in order to juice up and get the growth that we are looking at. And in the process of doing that, though, we need to ensure that not everyone in South Africa is urbanizing, because when we're thinking about economic growth in this country, there's always an urban bias. We talk about the township economy and all of these things that needs to be done in order to ensure that the society is well supported and we see a lot of economic activity. But in the rural economies, there's still many South Africans that are there. And I think then if you merge those two ideas of both searching for growth, but also making sure that the rural economies are not left behind, the agricultural sector is one of those that can ensure that we are able to achieve that growth that is inclusive of the rural economies. And of course, mining and many others can pretty much assist in that particular process. But for agriculture to unlock the growth of the rural economies in South Africa, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of infrastructure reforms, improving governance and the land governance, and many other aspects that we need to ensure that our rural economies function well. But I do think that it's also important to lay the foundation of what we are talking about here, because it's not just the rural economies, but it's also the value that we can be able to bring up for the economy from the agricultural sector. And many people typically think about, when we talk about agriculture, we are talking about a few large-scale farmers. The numbers that many of us have heard being quoted is that there are 40,000 commercial farmers in South Africa. And if you would indulge me a little bit as to where that figure pretty much comes from, what you are looking at the table now are the farmers in South Africa that pretty much pay the VAT, segmented into a whole range of where they fit in that category. You have some that have a turnover of over 22 million rands. Those would be the large-scale farmers. And you have others that have a turnover that is at around R1 million rand. Those you would consider as the micro farmers. But putting all of those farms together, they give you the 40,000 that people talk about. But that is not all that is commercial farming in South Africa. And it's also not all that is agriculture. When we talk about this rural economy and its benefit and many people that are in there, we are pretty much looking at a figure that is around 248 or so thousand people that are working in the farming sector, that are at the commercial level. What you see being circled, for example, in that table below, that just shows you the numbers of those people that we say they are at a commercial level. Commercial in this perspective, in a sense that those are all the people that produce for themselves, but also sell a certain level of their surplus to the market. There's also a whole range of another farmers that are over 2 million that I would say they are sitting on what we call the subsistence farming side. But overall, when we are thinking about the South African farming economy, we are talking about pretty much a well-diversified sector. And I think that the work that you do as a society in supporting the agricultural sector, it is perhaps maybe important that is framed in that context, that you are talking about the commercial sector, you are talking about a whole range of people that are not yet commercial, but are also producing and doing a lot of work for the household food security aspect. But I think broadly then, when we are thinking about the reality, to go back to the title of our input today, of the South African farming sector, is that we have been in this journey of saying agriculture must contribute to growth in South Africa. It's not a new conversation, but it's more emphasized now because of the low growth trap that we are in. But we've put a number of policies over the years to say these are some of the things that we need to do as a country in order to see the growth taking off in this country. But what we have failed on is implementing a number of those policies fully, to an extent that I would argue that if you look at the South African agricultural sector today, it is fair to say it is not yet at capacity. We probably still have over 4 million hectares of land that could be tilled, some of that in the former homelands, and some of that being part of the land that was acquired by the state under the PLUS Act, which is the proactive land acquisition strategy. So a lot of room for us to expand our agricultural activity, both on crop farming, on fruit, as well as on a livestock side. But I would say if you're looking at the various interventions that are on the screen, the one that I would say we probably as a country have implemented it fully is possibly the one that is on number 3, the Marketing Act, because that's what governs how our agricultural sector, is the fact that we no longer have a government setting up prices. The prices of commodities are set in an open market, unlike what we see in Zambia or other regions of Southern Africa, like for example in Zimbabwe right now, where the government has stopped the imports of maize. In South Africa, the government doesn't actually have control or practice that intervention in the farming sector. What is rather done is making sure that there are regulations that assist the sector, but we are operating in what you would call the free market environment. And I would say that free market environment, in part, is what has delivered the growth that we enjoy as a sector, of course, supported by some of the interventions that have been key at the scientific level on ensuring that the productivity of agriculture, either you are looking at crops, in terms of the seed cultivars, or in animals, in terms of the better genetics, we have been able to actually make some gains on that. But a number of some of these policies, even in as early as 2012, which is the Chapter 6 of the National Development Plan, which set out the strategies of what we needed to do, which is one, in making sure that the land in the former homelands, either it's the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, KZN, is in full production, released to people. We improved the land governance. We haven't done that. In revitalizing the irrigation schemes that we have in various areas of South Africa, we have not done that. Even thinking about the poultry master plan, I would argue that it's not being implemented fully. And on the agriculture and the agro-processing master plan, it's one of the latest intervention. And what the agriculture and agro-processing master plan seeks to do, it brings together what is on the NDP, what is in some of the old plans that the government had put in place, and try to crystallize them with some tangible intervention of what needs to be done in order to take our sector forward. So these are the realities of what is happening in the sector and what is constraining the sector at the moment. And I would say, though, while we are sitting there and not yet fully implementing even the master plan, there are a number of other own goals now that we are putting in as South Africa. All of you are scientists sitting in here from the society, but some of your fellow scientists that are vets and the others will tell you that animal diseases are a big issue in South Africa, and I'm sure you interact with that difficulty even here, some of you in the society. But it's not only in the animal diseases, but also on a plant and the crop diseases are some of the biggest issue, which I looked at the agenda of some of the themes that you will be discussing later on today and into tomorrow. they do touch on some of those aspects related to this. And I think our lack of investments and perhaps maybe a crystal focus on biosecurity is one of the weaknesses that we have. And some of the things are outside of the agriculture. When you're thinking about stock theft, you think about crime in rural South Africa, and even reforms in the water department. These are all the things that I would say, as South Africa, perhaps maybe we are not moving and strengthening enough our intervention on that, in addition to the lack of progress when you are thinking about the implementation of the plans that are there. And I would say if you live here in the Kruger area that this conference is taking place in, and you talk to some people that are in the livestock industry, not very far from here, they're suffering exactly with those diseases. And the core thing is our lack of investment at OBP and many of the vaccine manufacturing entities, even at the ARC, where the president of the society works in. I would say the ARC can do a lot on revitalizing its investment on the scientific aspects. And these are things that I think as a scientific society you need to think about. Because ultimately as South Africa, we do have a structure of what we should be doing in order to have a sector that is thriving and remaining quite competitive and quite a leader in the African continent. Because if you look at the structure of our regulators in each department, the structure is clear. I'm showing you here, for example, on an animal side, that all of the directorates, as well as the people that needs to be taking care of either surveillance or either on making sure that the livestock movement, we have all the right regulations and then they are followed through. We do have those structures. But I would say perhaps maybe we need people that are also dedicated on executing in some of those activities. We cannot only blame spending, but I do think that as South Africans and as scientists and many people that are officials, we need to look at ourselves and say, are we doing all of that which is enough to ensure that we control the spread of diseases? But this is not only a scientist issue. The farmers themselves, I do think that they can do a lot on making sure that they participate and play their role on limiting the movement of animals so that biosecurity remains a key. Because ultimately, if we don't do this, it actually harms them, the farmers. Because we sit with this sector, we are dependent on exports and a number of markets that we are exporting to. And without the strong biosecurity aspects, we are not going to be able to gain the access in those markets and see the economic benefits that we need to yield there. And I'm emphasizing the government a lot because when you're thinking about biosecurity in general, it is a public good. So the government has to do its part on that and making sure that all of the allocations are in place. And we have been talking about foot and mouth disease, but if you think about it, the citrus people, they struggle with the citrus black spot, false codling moth. There was a ghost wilt in the grain industry. So there's many of some of these things, which I think even yourselves in the study that you are in here in the society, some of the things that you are studying and you are looking at, they get to threaten the agricultural sector. And they are related to some of those risks that we look at when we are considering what's happening in there. And on the animal side, the reason many people have focused on is because of the impacts that they get to have, for example, on the exports. What you see on the graph there, for example, is wool and the beef exports. If you think about 2022 and 23, it's one of the periods where we are affected by the foot and mouth disease. And I would say in 2022, about 6 of our 9 provinces had the foot and mouth disease. And at that time, we saw that the red meat exports declined by roughly 19%. If you think about the wool exports, they also fell double digits, around 12% or so. And the core thing is not that there was a foot and mouth disease in wool, but there was that perception that South Africa is risky, it's having all of these animal diseases, and the likes of China, a country that buys about 70% of South African wool, they decided that they would temporarily block the imports from South Africa. So that just tells you a risk at which we are sitting in. But in agriculture in general, I think the core thing, if you take a moment and you look at the graph on your left-hand side, it is the blue bars that are going up. Those blue bars, they tell you about our exports over time. In the early 2000s, we're exporting about $2 billion of agricultural products. Right now, we are just under $14 billion. And at Agbiz, we think that for 2025, our agriculture exports will cross 14 billion US dollars for the first time in history. What that also comes with is the heavy reliance on the international markets. And at this time, where the conversation is about tariffs, there are other regions of the world, like the EU, that are not going to use the tariffs, but they will use the non-tariff barriers. And the non-tariff barriers links to issues of biosecurity. And the EU is one of our biggest markets, about 19%, as you see in the chart on your right-hand side. And of course, many other markets like Asia and the Middle East are also the largest markets that we have in agriculture. But the point is that half of our products go to export markets, and without making sure that we deal with the issues of biosecurity, we are at risk. The only country that is more confrontational and coming in with the exports is, of course, the United States, which has put on South Africa about 30% of the tariffs, but also there are tariffs against many other countries. In South Africa, we tend to think this is something that is just about us, but it's not about us. The US has put these tariffs, as many of you know, against a number of countries, and there are many others that face far higher tariffs than we face in South Africa. But the US is an important market for agriculture. About 4% of our products go to the US, especially the folks that are in the fruit, citrus, table grapes, nuts, and wine and ostrich leathers, the folks down there in the Southern Cape, amongst those that are affected by that. But I think the bottom point about the US is that it also introduces a lot of uncertainty in the world economy. We are coming from an era where, for many decades, since the 1920s, the tariffs have been declining globally. And that decline on the tariffs brought about in the world economy a period of prosperity where the living conditions were improving across the whole world. And if you could take a map of world growth and you overlay it with that decline on the tariffs that you were seeing in the US, we pretty much saw an opposite, an uptick in terms of growth, because what happened is trade brought about all of this prosperity and the growth in a number of economies. We are now reversing this, and of course this brings about the worries about where the world economy will be. Already, the likes of the IMF and the World Bank, they think that the world economy will grow at less than 3%. And you'll recall that the average growth of the world economy is about 3.6%. What this does, then, it means that there will be a lot of economic pressure in a number of areas. And I think as South Africa, where we are exporting to the whole range of countries in the world economy, we also then have to worry about the strength of the demand in a number of countries that we are exporting to, especially if they are facing all of these economic headwinds that we are seeing now. China is one of the important areas, the Middle East, Asia, and even the EU is very important to us. And I mean, you see now the euro growth is expected this year to be less than 1%. So of the high value products that we send to the world market, if you are thinking about fruits, wine, these are all of the aspects that we are thinking about and really worried. And I think there's also a geopolitical aspect that is playing in the US, because back in the 2000s and even years before that, the US had a bit of dominance when you were thinking about the world economy in terms of trade. For example, in the 2000s, the blue parts of the world map, they show you there where the US was deep in terms of trade and having a much more dominance. If you think about world trade at this moment, China has overtaken the US, and as you see the map on your right-hand side is pretty much red. It shows you the integration of China on that. And I think if you think about this as the China dominating the world economy in terms of trade, as well as the influence of the US, I think that there is that geopolitical tension between the two countries. But what is important for South Africa is not necessarily to be joining any of this side, but is learning how to exist in a world that is looking like that. There are countries that have learned that. I mean, you think about Australia. In Australia, China is one of their biggest markets. About over 30% of their exports go to Australia, vis-a-vis about 6% or so of their exports that go to the US, but they have a much more stronger relationship with the West, while at the same time they have a stronger relationship economically with the Eastern world, the likes of China, the likes of Japan. And I think in South Africa, it is in that balance that we need to strike to say, how do we begin to have friendships across the world, regardless of what each country has been. And there's a lot in politics that South Africa needs to fix with the US. But I think that it is a mistake to think that the South African problems began with President Trump. President Trump and his America First policy and his quite keen focus on South Africa just exaggerated something that was already in there, because South Africa, for a number of times, we've clashed with the US. Back in 2014-15, at the time where we had to renew AGOA, there was a friction about the chicken and the pork industry. And you fast forward to the 2020s, our intellectual property bill, the US was unhappy about some of the things we were doing there, as well as the politics of Lady R and the issues of Russia and our politics in the Middle East. This is a point of saying this is a relationship that has been going through a number of phases. And the key thing then is about how do we rekindle this relationship, because I think it would be careless to say, no, let's focus on this side and not choose the other side, because South Africa has to multiply friendships across the world and understand that we are a small open economy that is dependent on trading with everyone in the world economy. We don't have the luxury of having to pick who's going to be our friend and who's not. And I think that's that tough balance in our economic diplomacy as a country that we have to face. But I think with everything that is happening with the US, the most exposed industries are the one that you see highlighted in the third bullet point on the screen: the table grapes, nuts, citrus, fruit juices, and the wines, as I've mentioned. But overall, this is about 4% of our farming economy. It's not, I think it would be unfair to say the South African agricultural sector is collapsing because of the US. I would say there are pressure in certain industries, but overall, the sector still have a much more dominance in other parts of the world. What we also, though, need to do as South Africa, as much as we are revitalizing the conversation with the US, we need to work on trade diversification. This is something that you read in the newspapers a lot nowadays, but I think we need to actually have some tangible results on that. What do we mean about trade diversification? I would say before we even go out looking for markets, there's a lot of work that we need to do on improving and investing in our ports. We spent many years not investing in our ports, and you will recall that a few slides back, I showed the chart where I was showing that our agricultural exports grew from about $2 billion to under $14 billion, which means that even in volumes, we were increasingly having more volumes that have to go out of our ports, but we were not increasing the port capacity. But the products that needs to go to the world were increasing. And this causes a bit of a glut in our ports, but also then the lack of investments on renovating them was another issue. But of course now the private sector and Transnet are making some inroads, and we are beginning to see results, and I think that's something that needs to continue. But we also have to work on retaining the existing markets in the EU, Africa, Middle East. Go revisit all of those friends that we have and make sure that they are in good relationship with South Africa and the conversation continues. And that's the work that lies on the people at the DTIC, Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, as well as the people in the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And I know people in agriculture tend to only talk to the Department of Agriculture. Department of Agriculture is important for phytosanitary issues, but when you are thinking about broader trade, that's the mandate of DERCO, that's the mandate of DTIC. And it's very important that the people in the farming sector engage those folks, because they are the ones also that are leading our embassies to ensure that the relationships with the key markets is something that continues. But also then within the BRICS, and not be ideological about BRICS, but ask the serious question of, is there an economic value that we are getting from BRICS? And I would say at this moment, we are getting much more of a flag than we're getting paid for in BRICS, with the exception of China, of course, because China is an important market for South Africa. But I think that in other countries, we can increase the level of trade, particularly with India. And I think the core thing is about lower tariff and removal of the phytosanitary barriers, which is the point that we highlight in the last bullet point on that. And I think beyond the BRICS, the Middle East is very exciting for me. I mean, I look at Saudi Arabia. They spend nearly $30 billion buying food products from the world market, and South Africa is only 1% of that. So we can engage the Saudis, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in a much more ambitious way on strengthening our exports there. The same thing with the UAE, the same thing with Qatar. So I think there's a great potential in the Middle East for South Africa. So overall, we are a country where I would say now, looking forward on the reform of saying where we should be going in South Africa and what the focus should be, it will be around the issues of biosecurity, around the issues of making sure that we are agile on Act 36 of registering a whole range of agrochemicals that are necessary, but most importantly, the exports, both the logistics and the key markets. But we also have to work with other people that are outside the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Transport, maintaining roads in rural South Africa, which are in bad shape. Municipalities must do their part, but also rural crime. Stock theft is a big thing. We recently talked about this, where we were saying at Agbiz, probably over 100 cattle are stolen every day in South Africa. And that's a bad thing, because then that means that there are many people who use cattle as their store of wealth. And if you lose that much, and the numbers get worse when you are thinking about goats and sheep, over 250 sheep are stolen every day in South Africa. It's numbers like that where many people lose a lot of their wealth, and they're having to spend a lot on security, and others don't have means to put the security. So this becomes a major risk. So collaborating with the police is important in that angle. But also blended finance and statistics are all kinds of things that I think the South African agricultural sector should work on looking at. So for the themes that we wanted to talk about today, those are the key things that I would say are very important. And of course, and yes, I am advertising with the permission of the president or the chair of the association, that those are some of the books that we have written a lot about the key things in agriculture. But we thought this morning, as you are starting this symposium for the next 2 days, it was important to provide that framing of the agricultural economy and the agricultural sector in general, so that the work that you do, it is interlinked and it does assist our sector. You reflect on these papers and many presentations in that context of thinking about what are the important themes you are looking at in agriculture. And with that, let me thank you for watching and wish you well. I wish I was there in person, but we couldn't be there, which is why we came live online. And I hope that you found all of these insights useful. Thank you so very much for your time.